Welcome to the chalkboard, my fellow football nerds, for episode number 65 of Chalk Talk, brought to you by the Painted Lines. I'm your host, Shane Half. You can give me a follow on Twitter at halfandhalf_TPL. I'm joined today by the best co-host in the game. You've heard him on the Tough Cover radio show. It is Mark Henry Jr. Give him a follow on Twitter at MarkHenryJr_. Mark, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. Excited to talk about the division. We were just talking off air about these divisions that we're doing in the AFC, and I could sum it up by basically just saying AFC South bad, AFC West good, but we'll get into a little bit more detail than that.
And that would make for a really short podcast. And some people might say that we're a little too long anyways, so maybe we'll experiment with the 2-minute long podcast at some point. But today is not that day. We're going to do a deep dive into the divisions, the AFC West, the AFC South. That will leave us the AFC East and the North, and then we will have completed divisional previews for all the divisions. So if you've missed any of the NFC divisions, those are already done. Go check them out on our archive. But today, before we get there, we're going to introduce a new segment to the show here. We're going to do a question of the day. So sometimes they might be football related, sometimes not. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter with questions, the burning questions that you need answered. But the question for today, Mark, that I'm going to throw to you is give me a team that missed the playoffs last year that will make the playoffs this season.
I could go really. I have 5 teams that did not make the playoffs last year that I think will make the playoffs this year. But if I'm going to pinpoint down on one, and we talked off air that we should both leave the LA Chargers out of this since they're literally both of our Super Bowl pick and should have made the playoffs last year if the last game would have went a little bit differently. But I'm going to go ahead and go out on a little bit more of a limb than my other ones and say the Minnesota Vikings. And we touched on it on our one NFC divisional preview where we talked about the North, but I'm really high on this Minnesota roster and the situation now that you kind of get what seemed like a toxic situation with Mike Zimmer and Kirk Cousins. You put that aside, offensive mind coach in there who I think really will get the most out of guys like Dalvin Cook. And if he goes down, Alexander Mattison is a really good backup running back. And then not to mention, of course, you have probably the second best receiver in football in Justin Jefferson and a top 20 to 25 receiver in Adam Thielen. So I think there's a ton of reasons to be excited about the offense. And then the defense, you bring in Lewis Seen, who is getting rave reviews in training camp on the little that I do see from Vikings Twitter. I've seen a lot about Lewis Seen. And then a guy in Andrew Booth Jr., who that I was extremely high on going through the draft process and extremely high on as a guy who I thought could play right away. So I think them adding a Booth at corner and a Seen at safety, I think that is going to do wonders for their secondary, not only long-term, but right away. Like, I think that this is going to be a different Vikings team than we're used to over the last couple of years in terms of finding ways to lose. I don't think it's going to be quite that way. I think this is going to be an 11-plus win team. They're going to compete with Green Bay in that division, but I'm not saying they're going to win the division, but they'll be in the playoffs.
All right, so you are high on the Vikings. The Vikings are currently minus 130 to make the playoffs, so you can go put the bet on them there. And we have talked about the Vikings a little bit. I'm going to take a little bit bigger of a leap here. I'm going to go with a team that is plus 400 to make the playoffs, a team that we're actually going to talk about today. So I won't get too much into why right now, but it's the Jacksonville Jaguars. Second-year quarterback Trevor Lawrence, who I think played a lot better than people give him credit for last year with a coach that didn't even want to be a coach. Now he's got Doug Peterson, a guy that we both thought was one of the better candidates available this hiring cycle. I just think that this is a team that I've got money on Doug Peterson to win Coach of the Year at plus 1,800. I've got money on the Jags to make the playoffs at plus 400. Let me list for you, Mark, a couple teams that have better odds to make the playoffs than the Jags. The Carolina Panthers at plus 350, the Chicago Bears at plus 375, the Detroit Lions at plus 350, the Pittsburgh Steelers at plus 300. Even the Seattle Seahawks are just slightly behind at plus 425. And I just think that that's a tremendous amount of disrespect, comparatively for what I think Doug Peterson and Trevor Lawrence are going to be able to do together. So I'm you heard it here, maybe not first, but you heard it here. I'm picking the Jags to make it to the playoffs this year. And if they do, I'm going to get a nice little payout because that will mean that Doug Peterson's going to win Coach of the Year.
Yeah, that's definitely one where you put your onions out there. And I didn't realize the Vikings would be minus 130 to make the playoffs. I would have guessed that would be in the plus money. So I thought I was going out on a little more of a limb than I was. But Shane took that limb and went all the way out on it. And I don't hate it, by the way. We'll get to the reasons why, like Shane said, because we're going to talk about that division on the show. I don't have quite the stones to go there and to pick Jacksonville to make the playoffs, but I'm pretty close. So I think that there is definitely a lot of value in that plus 400, especially considering teams like the Lions and the Bears being in front of them. So I'm with you there.
We've got a comment coming here on YouTube that says Eagles, AFC, yes. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know what that means, but welcome to the show. Glad you are here. We are previewing the AFC. Let's start off with the AFC West here. And we're going to start with the Kansas City Chiefs. And so the Kansas City Chiefs, they had an interesting offseason. Obviously, the headline move is trading Tyreek Hill. We'll get there. But their key additions, they added Trent McDuffie and George Karlaftis. Both of us were high on Karlaftis in the draft. I was really high on McDuffie, although Mark was not. And they added Sky Moore in the second round. They went out and they signed Justin Reed in free agency. They also acquired Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, obviously, the big loss was Tyreek Hill. They traded him to the Dolphins for the picks that became Karlaftis and Sky Moore, as well as a fourth rounder and some future capital. So when it's all said and done, that's not, they're betting on Mahomes here being able to be elite with, losing one of his best weapons. But I think they got a pretty good return in that deal. They released Anthony Hitchens to clear $8.4 million. They lost cornerback Shavarius Ward, who got an outlandish contract, got paid way more than he should have. They lost Tyrann Mathieu. They lost Byron Pringle, Melvin Ingram, and Austin Blythe. And so I'm curious here, Mark, before we get into the schedule, they traded out basically the Honey Badger for Justin Reed. Did they upgrade at safety or did they take a step back there?
That's a good question. It's such a good question that I'm not going to give an answer. I probably think it's a wash. Like I probably think overall Honey Badger probably brings some intangible things that maybe aren't going to be measured quite as much, especially since he had been on the team for a while and had been on the team through some winning seasons. But Justin Reed is probably, in terms of the numbers and stuff like that, he might be slightly better. But like I said, there's probably some unquantifiable stuff there in terms of what they're losing. So I'm going to say it's mostly a wash there. It's going to be interesting, really. The Tyreek Hill thing that you mentioned, obviously, is going to be the main focus. They've got a ton of options, though, man. Like that, they have 4 legitimate, I would say, wide receiver 2s or 3s right now in MVS and Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who's getting a lot of the pub out there in terms of training camp. MVS seems to be the guy who is kind of wowing people with kind of his instant connection with Patrick Mahomes. Sky Moore, I've seen some really positive stuff about in this training camp blotter as well. Mecole Hardman, he's been a guy who people have expected to step up for a long time and hasn't really gotten to that level. He still had 59 catches for close to 700 yards last year, so he was still pretty productive, and you'd assume without Tyreek Hill's speed and with Mecole Hardman's speed, he will still be a pretty big part of that offense. So that's just another guy right there. And that's before getting to Juju Smith-Schuster, who just a couple years ago, before Ben Roethlisberger turned into a corpse, Juju Smith-Schuster was considered one of the best receivers in the game, and at least one of the best young receivers on the rise in the game. And I'm not saying he's going to get back to that form, but would it shock anybody if Juju came out and had, 80 catches for 1,000 yards? Like, I don't think that would shock anybody in this offense with Andy Reid at the helm, calling plays, with Patrick Mahomes gunslinging. So a lot of people are going to talk about the loss of Tyreek Hill, and, I more than anybody have made an argument in the past that Tyreek Hill is the most valuable non-quarterback outside of Aaron Donald in the sport. So I do think that there's part of me that wishes they would have been able to hold on to Tyreek Hill almost at all costs. and you maybe get rid of Kelsey or get rid of someone highly priced on the defense. But having said that, looking at the names that they brought in and the names that they still have, it's still Patrick Mahomes. It's still Travis Kelsey. It's still Andy Reid. There's still names on defense to be really excited about. So while I may not have them winning the division, which we'll get to, I think the Chiefs are an absolute lock to be in the playoffs. I've seen a lot of Chiefs negativity and kind of people expecting the regression, and there might be some regression there. I still think this is an 11 or a 12-win team.
Yeah, so they come into this season with the most difficult, the number 32 ranked strength of schedule. So they've got a tough schedule. Their over-under for the year is set at 10.5 wins. It is minus 115, whichever side you take. Mark, are you taking them over or under 10.5 wins? You're muted.
Just I pulled a Dibes there talking on mute, but if I was making a play on every single over, if we were keeping track, which we probably should. I mean, we could go back and pretty easily do it. We should keep track of every single over and under that we have. This wouldn't be one I'd bet on personally, because I do think 10.5 is a tough number, especially in that division, which we'll get to the reasons why. But I would go over. I would lean over since I do have them at 12 wins. I would lean on that over, but not one that I would go out of my way to place money on.
Yeah. All right. I'm the same as you. I would take the over if I had to, but this is a line that I would stay away from. For me, one of the biggest things for the Chiefs to watch this year is last year they were 29th in the league in sacks. And so they drafted a guy in George Karlaftis, who you and I both thought is a guy that can come in and contribute immediately. And he may not have the highest ceiling like a guy like Kayvon Thibodeau has, or even a guy like Trey Walker, someone that we weren't as high on but recognized the potential. Karlaftis is going to come in and be a steady presence. And so the question is, how much impact can he make early on opposite Frank Clark to boost this pass rush? That's the biggest thing for me that I want to see the Chiefs. Obviously, the offense we've talked about, seeing how they move on post Tyreek Hill. And then on the defensive side, it's all about that pass rush for me.
Yeah, I mean, Karlaftis is a guy who we both absolutely loved. I had him in the top 10 on my big board last year, and he was a guy who I did think could step in right away and, be an 8+ sack kind of guy and account for a ton of tackles for losses as well. He's pretty good in the rush and the pass, so that's going to be something to watch for. Another thing, and I can't remember where you were at on this guy, and I wasn't particularly in love with him or anything, but Leo Chanal was a guy that they took in the 3rd round to plug in, and he's expected to kind of play and start right away at linebacker. He's another guy who I did see as kind of a ready-made prospect, and he's kind of an exciting name too. Like, they have a lot of rookies that we're going to kind of keep tabs on, and with their success in the draft as of late, it's hard to doubt some of these guys. I mean, we saw it with Creed Humphrey last year with how amazing he was right away in terms of starting right off of being a rookie. I think that they're going to be counting on a good amount of rookies here in terms, whether that be Sky Moore, whether that be George Karlaftis, whether that be Leo Chanal. I think that they're going to be counting on a good amount of rookies, and we'll see how that turns out for them.
Yeah, Chanal was my linebacker 6 in the draft. I had him at 68 overall on my big board. Looks like you had him at 62, so we were about the same place on Chanal.
Yeah, that makes sense. He was probably a little bit of a steal in the 3rd round where they got him, but nothing crazy like the Kobe Dean or anything.
Right. Absolutely. All right, let's roll on to Las Vegas, to the Raiders. So obviously they have a huge addition in the wide receiver room in Davante Adams, who they traded a 1st and 2nd round pick for. They also traded Yannick Ngakoue for Rock Ya-Sin. They signed Chandler Jones, who's coming off a 10.5 sack season in Arizona, and they signed Bilal Nichols. On the flip side, guys, they lost Richie Incognito, retired. They lost wide receiver Brian Edwards. It was just a little trade. I think they got like a 7th round pick. They lost wide receiver Zay Jones and cornerback Casey Hayward. They have the 30th ranked strength of schedule, so very difficult schedule this year for the Raiders. Their over-under is at 8.5 with a minus 125 if you take the over, a minus 105 for the under. What are you thinking about this Raiders team this year?
This is one of the teams that I have the toughest time on in the entire NFL on kind of placing what this team is going to be. I talked about on my radio show on Saturday that I think the Eagles have one of the smallest ranges of outcomes. Like, I think they're going to be between 9 to 11 wins. You could sell me on a lot of different directions of this Raiders season. Like, you could sell me the fact that this division's just too tough and they win 6 to 7 games and they're kind of the odd man out in the AFC West in terms of competing. You could tell me that they finish right in the middle at 8 or 9 wins, maybe just miss the playoffs. Or you can tell me that this is the team that steps up and surprises a lot of people and wins 11-plus games. Like, there's a lot to be excited about in terms of adding Davante Adams. You have Hunter Renfrow. You have Darren Waller. You have Josh Jacobs and some backup pieces to filter him in with running back that Josh McDaniels inevitably is going to do. You have Derek Carr in a system with a guy like Josh McDaniels, who I believe in Josh McDaniels. I know that a lot of people are not very high on McDaniels. I think that guy is an offensive genius. I know he's made some weird decisions. He wasn't ready for the job when he was in Denver a long time ago. I think that there's a lot to be excited about in Vegas. There are some concerns on the defensive side of the ball. There are some concerns on the offensive line that are kind of holding me back and keeping me in the middle. But I'm not going to say that they have that worst potential outcome that I brought up where they win 6 or 7 games and come in last in the division. I think it's hard to sell me on a team that made the playoffs last year and competed with the team that went to the Super Bowl. They're going to be much worse after adding one of the best receivers in football in Davante Adams. So I do think that the Raiders will be in the mix. I don't know if that means they make the playoffs, but I think they'll be in the mix. I have them at 9 wins.
Yeah, I would take the over. This is another one I wouldn't put money on. I don't have money on, but I would take the over for a lot of the reasons you said. I just can't imagine them being worse. If they were in literally any other division, this is a team that you're picking probably to win that division and make the playoffs. Well, maybe not. They might not win some of the divisions, but you'd be picking them to make the playoffs in any other division. But here, it's just tough. This is such a loaded division. The biggest question mark for me is their offensive line. They allowed 40 sacks last year of Derek Carr. It was 11th most in the league, and they really didn't do anything to address the offensive line. They lost Richie Incognito. They have Alex Leatherwood, who they took ridiculously too high. I had like a late day 2 grade on him, and they took him in the first round last year. And they moved him to offensive guard after 4 games because he was so bad at tackle. Like, this is a team that hasn't drafted well. And at a certain point, those chips come due. And so I think that's the biggest question mark for them is what are they getting on the offensive line? Are they going to be able to keep Derek Carr upright? That's the biggest concern for me from the Raiders.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that they just had a guy retire this week that was supposed to be a starter on their offensive line. So, the hits keep on coming for that Raiders O-line. And that, like I said, that's kind of the thing that's holding me back from buying in on this team. But like you said, if this team was in a ton of other divisions, especially the other division that we'll talk about today, we'd be picking them to win it.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep the train rolling here to the Los Angeles Chargers. This is a team that made a lot of additions this offseason. They got Zion Johnson in the draft, so it bolsters their offensive line. They went and they traded for Khalil Mack. They give up a second-round pick that turned into Jaquan Brisker for the Bears. So, there's good value there for the Bears in that trade at least. They also gave up a future 6th-rounder. They signed J.C. Jackson. They signed Sebastian Joseph Day. They signed defensive tackle Austin Johnson. They signed tight end Gerald Everett. So, they made some big moves here, most notably addressing their interior offensive line and then edge rusher and cornerback. They were terrible against the run last year. They went and got a big run stopper in Sebastian Joseph Day. The biggest concern, I think, for me from them is Storm Norton is still their starting right tackle, which isn't ideal. But they also lost defensive tackle Justin Jones. They lost outside linebacker Kazir White. And they lost another linebacker, Uchenna Nwosu. So some of their additions and subtractions, they definitely gained far more than they lost. This team has the 20th ranked strength of schedule, so a little easier than the Chiefs or the Raiders, but still an above average schedule in terms of difficulty. Their over-under is at 10.5, and it is minus 130 for the under. It is even if you take the over. Mark, you and I are both very high on this team. Tell me what you're thinking here.
Yeah, I almost don't even want to spend that much time on them because I think we're going to talk about them so much throughout the rest of the offseason, and we've already talked about them on our kind of contender shows when we were talking about the Super Bowl stuff, and I feel like I've really broken this team down more than any other. But I think this is a team that's going to get off to a very fast start. I mean, you look at the start of the season. Week 3, you've got Jacksonville. Week 4, you've got Houston. Week 5, you've got at Cleveland, probably without Deshaun Watson. Week 6, you've got Denver at home. Denver we'll get to in a minute. I'm not as high on Denver as a lot of other people. Then you get Seattle at home. Then you get a bye. Then you go to the Atlanta Falcons, whose over-under is 4.5. While we're both higher on them than that, it's not like they're going to be some contender. So that is a stretch from week 3 to week 9 where they're not playing a team that's going to contend, in my opinion.
Right.
So
they should be 7-1 when they head to San Francisco for week 10.
Yeah, they really should. I mean, I really think there's a chance this is the team that's kind of 8-0 this year, where people are like, oh, is the Chargers going to go 13-0 or 17-0, whatever it be? I don't know, 13-0. I don't know where that came from, but I think the Chargers are going to get started really, really hot this year, and I think that, like I said on one of our pods already, I think what happened with the Rams last year and what happened with Aaron Donald when they brought in the name is escaping. Von Miller. They brought in Von Miller, who's now in Buffalo. That's why the name was escaping me there. But when they brought him in, it really unleashed Aaron Donald and allowed him to kind of not be focused on by the entire offensive line. I think the exact same thing is going to happen in terms of Khalil Mack's impact on Bosa. I think Bosa maybe probably my pick for Defensive Player of the Year right now in terms of where I'd be right now. I think he's going to have a huge year. And then I think their biggest addition was J.C. Jackson, who I always say this when I talk about J.C. Jackson, but J.C. Jackson is everything that people want Trevon Diggs to be. Everyone wanted to make Trevon Diggs turnovers a huge deal last year. And while I did defend him, even though he gave up like the most yards in the sport at his position, he was making big plays. And those big plays obviously were impactful. But J.C. Jackson does that without killing you in terms of biting on way too much and giving up a ton of yards. So I think J.C. Jackson is going to be an immeasurable addition to this team.
Yeah, they didn't make the playoffs last year, but I think they've got one of the best young quarterbacks in football. They've got a loaded offense in terms of weapons. They added to the interior offensive line. They added another really good pass rusher and a really good corner, and they stacked up their defensive line to help stop the run, which they were terrible at last year. This is, the second year of the head coach. The Chargers are my Super Bowl pick. They're your Super Bowl pick. I don't want to talk about them a lot, like you said, because we've talked about them so much, but I think the Chargers are going to be really good. I think they hit week 10 at 7-1. And so I'm obviously going to take the over at 10.5 because I don't think they're going to pull a Cardinals and then lose 7 of their last 8 games or something like that. This is a team that's going to be a lot of fun to watch this year. I'm glad they're in the AFC. So as someone who roots for the Eagles, I can watch the Chargers and just pull for them. This is the AFC team that I'll be pulling for week in and week out because I just think Justin Herbert is so much fun to watch.
Yeah, and just a quick little shout out. I read the magazine that I kind of had to thumb through while we're doing these, and they have the roster right here and the schedules right here, and it's all easy for me. Lindy Sports. I wanted to bring this up actually before this. They picked the Chargers to come in last in the AFC West. So
wow,
wild prediction from Lindy Sports. I think that is egregious. They're not only going to come they're going to come in first in the AFC West, and they're going to come in first in the NFL when they win the Super Bowl, like we mentioned.
What would be crazy is if, with 3 wild card teams now, if all 4 teams from this division made the playoffs somehow, that'd be wild.
I don't think we'll have to worry about that.
I don't think we're going to have to worry about that. For the case of the team that we're about to talk about, it's the Denver Broncos. So their additions, they added Nick Bonito through the draft, which wasn't like a high pick, but he's a Sooner and a guy I was really high on, so I've got to mention him. They traded for Russell Wilson. They gave up, still mind-boggling, they gave up a first, a second, a fifth, a first next year, a second next year, Drew Lock, Noah Fant, and Shelby Harris to acquire Russell Wilson. They also signed Randy Gregory, which was hilarious. If you don't remember that during the offseason, the Cowboys announced they were signing Randy Gregory. And then Randy Gregory announced that, nope, I'm actually signing with Denver. So that was kind of fun to see that play out. They also signed defensive tackle DJ Jones. They lost Teddy Bridgewater, which isn't a loss considering they brought in Russell Wilson. They lost Kyle Fuller, and then, of course, the guys they traded in the Wilson deal. They have the 17th hardest schedule this year, so they've got the easiest schedule in the division. Their over-under is at straight 10, with under is a minus 125, over is a minus 105. And Mark, before you tell me what you're taking here, I got to ask you this question. Is Russell Wilson the worst quarterback in this division?
No. I think Derek Carr is, and I like Derek Carr a lot. But I still would lean Russell Wilson over Derek Carr. If you told me Russell Wilson was on the Raiders instead of Carr, and you told me Carr was on the Broncos instead of Wilson, I'd probably have the Broncos about a win worse, and I'd probably have the Raiders about a win higher. But Mahomes is first and Herbert is second without even a question, in my opinion. So there's no comparison with Herbert and Wilson anymore, personally. But you heard me mention how easy that one part of the Chargers schedule was. Now let's kind of do the opposite here. You said that they had the easiest strength of schedule, and that's fine. But let's take a look at how the Broncos closed the year. And we have it on the screen, obviously, as well for anyone watching on YouTube. But it starts with, on December 4th, they go to Baltimore. They come back and play Kansas City at home. They play Arizona at home. Then they go on the road to the LA Rams, Super Bowl champions. They go on the road to Arrowhead at Kansas City. And then they play the LA Chargers at home in the last week. That is, wow. That is 6 really, really, really brutal matchups. Maybe not Arizona. Maybe Arizona a little bit worse this year. And they're, who knows? They definitely have dumpster fire potential over there in Arizona. I pick every game of the schedule for these projections. I have the Broncos losing the last 6 games. That's a funny little sidebar here. So I guess I have the Broncos starting 7-4 and then going 7-10. So that would be a bizarre season for Denver.
That Cardinals game should be pretty easy for them. That's about a month after Call of Duty comes out. So Kyler Murray should be grinding Call of Duty pretty hard by that point in time.
That's great. And it's also when Cliff Kingsbury starts focusing on Tinder and Hinge more than the NFL season. So
yeah. So their closing schedule is brutal, which I will say, you would rather play your difficult opponents late in the year because it gives them time to get injured. I've always said, you want to play the bad teams early before they have time to figure something out. You want to play the good teams late when injuries can kind of take their toll. But it's a brutal close to the schedule for the Broncos. I'm not as high on the Broncos as a lot of people are. A lot of people talk about, they've got all these weapons. And, they've got Jerry Jeudy, and he hasn't had good quarterback play. So, maybe he's as good as we thought he was coming out in the draft. But he's yet to prove it. You're going to have a quarterback learning a new system. You've got a new head coach. There's just a lot of variables here. In a different division, I still wouldn't be stoked about the Broncos, but I would feel better about them. I'd feel good about them maybe going into the next offseason when they've had a year for it to all come together. But being thrown into the fire in this division, I just don't see how the Broncos make a run to the playoffs here. I would take the under if I was betting this one. This isn't one I'd bet, but I would take the under. And I just feel like this is the team that will probably come in last in this division. And they may come in last with 9 wins. I'm not saying they're going to be a 4-win team. I think they'll be fine. But they're just in a stacked division, and only so many teams can make the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about this when the Broncos traded for Russ, I remember. And I remember the phrase I kept saying was their front office is writing checks that their roster can't cash. Like, if you're going to go and make that trade, and you mentioned all the picks that they traded to get Russell Wilson, you need to be ready to compete right away. Like, if you're going to go make that move for an aging quarterback who is at the peak of his powers, or should be at the peak of his powers, then you need to be ready to go and win a Super Bowl. And I never, ever understood a lot of the optimism that's out there about the Broncos. I don't think the offensive line is anything outwardly special. In terms of they're playing really young, a couple of really, really young guys who are not extremely proven. Jerry Jeudy has had his issues with drops, and he's a guy I liked coming out of college, and he's a prospect who I do think has talent. but he's had his issues with drops. Cortland Sutton's a guy who's never been able to stay healthy. Tim Patrick's a guy who I'm not overly excited about Tim Patrick, to be quite honest. I've never really been crazy about him. KJ Hamler showed absolutely nothing last year to make me think that he's going to be relevant this year. And then Javonte Williams is a guy who's getting drafted in the top 20 in fantasy. He's splitting carries 50-50 with an aging, average as it gets Melvin Gordon, and he can't take the job away from him. So what does that say about him? So I'm not crazy about this offense. And then I've also heard people mention like how good this defense can be. I think there's a lot of ifs on this defense, and Bradley Chubb has not been healthy consistently in 3 years now. So I think him going into his fifth-year option, I get that he's playing for a contract, and this is a huge year for Bradley Chubb. He can be really good. He's really good per snap, all that stuff. He's got to stay healthy, and he's got to be able to prove that he can stay out there on the field. And I've heard this secondary be mentioned as potentially one of the best secondaries in football. I don't know how that can be the case when Ronald Darby is your second best corner. And I don't know how that can be the case when Kareem Jackson's your one safety. He's been playing since like the Clinton administration. That guy's like 35 years old. So I think you're banking on a lot of guys who are either injury prone or old on this roster, or you're banking on young guys taking a leap, which I don't know if you can bank on that quite yet, just by proxy of having Russell Wilson in the building on offense. So I think there's a lot more ifs with this Broncos team than there are with any of the other AFC West teams.
We should start dating players based on the president that was in office when they came in.
It was definitely a stretch to say Clinton, but
Tom Brady's literally been playing since like the first year of the Clinton administration.
That's crazy.
All right, let's roll on. So that completes the good division. Let's go to the bad division now, and we will start off. We will start off with probably the worst one seed of my lifetime from last year, and that's the Tennessee Titans. If you watched Chalk Talk last season, you heard Mark and I telling you, in November, maybe even October, that the Titans were frauds, that they did nothing in the playoffs again. Now, give them credit for getting there. They took care of business in the regular season, but they just one and done in the playoffs like usual. So this year they lose A.J. Brown. They trade him for a first-round pick that turns into Treylon Burks, who was a receiver that I was very, very high on. Treylon Burks was my wide receiver one in the draft. But I will say he has the widest range of outcomes of all of the receivers. Like if Burks comes out this year and he's just absolutely dreadful and can't get on the field by the end of the year, I'd be like, yeah, okay. And if Burks comes out and lights the whole league on fire and is Deebo Samuel 2.0, I would also not be surprised. Like he has just such a wide range of outcomes. But so they get Treylon Burks. They get Roger McCreary, cornerback. They drafted Malik Willis in the third round, which was an absolute steal. They traded a sixth-round pick for Robert Woods, which was another really good deal. I really like Robert Woods. He's a really good run blocker, which fits well with this offense. They got Austin Hooper. Obviously, they lost A.J. Brown. They lost Roger Saffold, Janoris Jenkins, and I have Roger Saffold on my list twice for some reason. They have the 21st ranked strength of schedule, so pretty difficult schedule. Their over-under is at 9, and it is minus 115 for both. Mark, where are you at with the Titans?
9 wins will win this division. Like, no doubt about it in my brain. I don't know if any of the teams get there. I have the Titans winning the division at 8 and 9. There's a bad division where every single year we see a 4 seed in one of the conferences at 8 or 9 wins. I think we'll see it again this year, and it's going to be Tennessee. And I think that it makes a ton of sense that Tennessee has lost a ton, and everyone is kind of counting them out on winning the division. And I feel like the Colts have kind of been handed this division nationally in terms of pundits and everyone that's picking this. And I think Vegas has the Colts pretty favored in terms of the division. There's part of me that still just kind of buys into Mike Vrabel and buys into the fact that they were the second best rushing defense last year. But I think Derrick Henry, he is running out of steam, but I do think he's pretty darn good and gives that offense a pretty high floor while he's healthy out there and kind of helps Tannehill before he, throws up all over himself in the playoffs. I think Ryan Tannehill, every year, and I've been guilty of it in the past, of just expecting the Tennessee Titans regression. Because I think there's been a couple years here where they've been a little bit fraudulent and winning the division and winning, double-digit games. And I am predicting a regression, obviously, to 8 wins. But the reason I'm not predicting a regression beyond that or to the point where they're not going to win the division is because maybe we just have to accept that this is a regular season football team. Like maybe we just have to accept this is kind of I know you're not a basketball guy. Kind of the Utah Jazz of the NFL. Like the Jazz, just like they roll the balls out there, they win 50 games, they're boring. No one ever buys them at any point as a Super Bowl contender, but they're there as a 4 seed in the playoffs, and they're losing the first round, and that's kind of how it is. It's the same way with the Titans at this point. I know they had that one run to the AFC Championship, but I think the Titans have more things to be excited about than the Colts at this point. So that's why I lean Titans. Obviously, you mentioned the team that you think is going to make the playoffs, and I could be sold on that team over this team. As you can hear in my voice, I'm not excited about the Titans, but I'm less unexcited about the Titans than I am the other 3 teams in the division. That's the best way I can put it. I'm less unexcited about them.
The biggest issue for me with the Titans is their right tackle. It's a major issue. Dylan Reddins played 124 snaps as a rookie last year, and he had a 49.7 PFF grade. He got 1 start in week 15 because of injuries, and he surrendered a sack, 3 hits, and 5 pressures in his 1 start, and they made him a game day inactive the next 2 weeks. So he's projected to be their starter this year. That's really bad, especially for a team that they can't afford to take sacks. They can't afford to have tackles for loss because this is not an explosive offense. They have to stay ahead of the sticks. That's the biggest issue for me. I would take the under on this. I don't see this as a 10-win team. If it was 9.5, or if it was 8.5, I might take the over and say they could get to 9 wins. But I just think, and I've thought this for years, but I think they're primed for regression. I don't think Derrick Henry can continue to just drag this team, past the rest of the offensive incompetence. And losing A.J. Brown is a huge deal for this team. Like Treylon Burks has to come in now, and he has to be ready to go week 1 and be able to play a major part for this offense. And he's not ready for that. He's sort of a gadget guy. He's not a route runner yet. You can throw him deep balls, and we know Tannehill likes to just chuck up deep balls, but I have major concerns about this team's offense. So I would take the under here. I don't think the Titans are going to make it to the playoffs this year.
Yeah, if I'm picking every single over and under, like I said, I would take the under, but I'm not. This is not one that I would go and bet. But as I'm sitting here looking at the defense and looking at the starters, I'm starting to talk myself in a little bit more that this team, the defense is really good. I think the defense is going to be really good again, and I don't know why I wasn't coming into this exercise thinking that, I guess. But Christian Fulton had a great year last year at corner. He's become a legitimate starting option. Caleb Farley was a guy I know you loved last year. Obviously had injuries coming into last year, so this is kind of a big kind of prove it year for Farley. But even beyond that, obviously Kevin Byard, one of the best safeties in the entire NFL, is still there as starting at free safety. But then you've got pretty strong depth. They just drafted Roger McCreary in the 2nd round. He's the guy who I'd expect to play right away. They drafted Elijah Molden last year in the 3rd round, and he was playing really well by the end of the season. Buster Skrine is kind of like one of those typical 78 overall and Madden type guys, so you can kind of plug in as a depth option at cornerback. Like, there's a lot to – you obviously have the bigger names like Harold Landry and Bud Dupree and obviously Jeffrey Simmons in the front 7. Man, now that we're doing this, maybe I'll bump them up to 9 wins. Maybe it's tough, so maybe it's a push for me. But I'll stick with 8 and 9, but I'll stick with them winning the division as well. I'm starting to get a little bit more excited about the Titans as we get closer, I guess.
All right, let's roll on to the Indianapolis Colts, who added one of our favorite non-first round prospects this year in the draft. That's tight end Jelani Woods, just a super athletic guy. They traded for Matt Ryan. They gave up a 3rd round pick. They also traded Carson Wentz. They got basically what it amounts to when you break down the picks going each way, in those two separate deals. They basically traded Wentz and a 7 for Ryan and a second rounder next year. So they made out like bandits in that deal for a guy that they basically said they were going to cut if no one would take him. They traded Rock Ya-Sin for Yannick Ngakoue. They signed Stephon Gilmore, and they went out and they signed Nick Foles. So obviously they're going to win the Super Bowl now. On the losses side, they lost guard Mark Glowinski. They lost defensive end Al Quadon Muhammad, and they lost safety George Odom. They have the number 3 strength of schedule, so a very easy schedule. Their over-under is at 9.5, with the over at minus 155. The under is at plus 125. Where are you at with this team?
This is one of my favorite unders in the entire NFL, and it is a long-running thing on this podcast and a long-running take of mine in life that Matt Ryan, I believe I said it 2 or 3 years ago, Matt Ryan will never quarterback a team that is a winning team ever again. He will never quarterback a team that goes over 500 ever again. Over my dead body will Matt Ryan succeed. I'm joking, but I very much have had that take, and I think Matt Ryan is far, 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 far more cooked than anyone wants to admit. And you mentioned the one thing that I wanted to touch on there where if we're just looking at it from a value perspective, them giving up Wentz in a 7 for Ryan in a second, it makes a lot of sense. They got good value there. But no one's going to be talking about that value if Matt Ryan stinks. And I think that's really possible. I think Matt Ryan is going to stink. I think he's a statue at this point. So I think that a lot of people want to blame the Falcons' offensive line for some of Matt Ryan's struggles last year. How about go watch the tape? He was taking self-sacks 2 to 3 times per game, where if you're another quarterback, maybe you try to escape that. Maybe you try to throw it away instead of just crumpling to the ground like you're Kirk Cousins. So I have a lot of problems with a lot of the Matt Ryan conversation that's around.
Which is relevant because do you know who the Colts starting left tackle is?
Yeah. Who is it again?
Matt Pryor.
Matt Pryor, yeah. I had Dennis.
Which is not ideal for a quarterback that's a statue that takes too many sacks.
Yeah, go ahead.
As I say, and their receivers are a mess too. Like they have Michael Pittman. Outside of that, they've got nothing. Like their wide receiver 2 is Alec Pierce, who was a 2nd-round pick. Their wide receiver 3 has averaged 120 yards per year over the last 3 years. So I don't know who Matt Ryan is throwing the ball to on this team. I mean, this team will go as far as Jonathan Taylor can take it.
Yeah, and the defense, just like Tennessee, there's a lot to be excited about on defense. I mean, you have DeForest Buckner, who's an absolute stud. Yannick Ngakoue, who, in my opinion, is one of the more underrated players in the NFL on both sides of the ball. I really like Ngakoue. He's always been a guy that I like. Kwity Paye was a guy who was a little bit disappointing last year as a rookie, but we'll see if he kind of develops a little bit further. Darius Leonard, who I believe just changed his name. Did you see that? Darius Leonard changed his name?
I didn't see that.
I forget what it's to now, of course, now that we're talking about it. Stephon Gilmore they brought in. There's a lot of things to be excited about on defense. But, and by the way, you mentioned Matt Pryor, and I kicked myself because I thought it was Dennis Kelly. No, they have a Matt Pryor versus Dennis Kelly left tackle competition going on in training camp. That is like straight out of Eagles. I don't even know right there. That's pretty crazy. But
Shaquille Leonard. That's what he changed his name to.
Shaquille, yeah. What are your thoughts?
I mean, as long as he doesn't have to shoot free throws, I guess it's okay.
That's pretty good. That was a good one. Yeah. I like it. I like Shaquille Leonard. It sounds better. I think he sounds like a Hall of Famer now. Shaquille Leonard. I can buy into that guy's a Hall of Famer. Not that he wouldn't have been before, but I kind of think that Carson Wentz has been given a raw deal. And we talked about this when we talked about the Commanders, how I'm a little bit higher on the Commanders than a lot of people are. Carson Wentz basically made Michael Pittman a thing last year. Like Michael Pittman had not been a thing yet, and Michael Pittman broke forward as a guy finally last year with Carson Wentz. So I don't know. I think Carson Wentz was better than people want to admit. I think a lot of people don't like Carson Wentz, and I think a lot of people solely remember those last game or two with Wentz where he was dreadful and he cost them the playoff season when all he had to do was beat the Jags. And I get how pathetic that is. But I think people forget that he was 27 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. He was like 3,500 yards, and they were I believe they were like 8-4 or like 7-4 at one point in the season. So I think that people just expect like, oh, anything from Matt Ryan's a positive because Carson Wentz stunk last year. I don't know if that's necessarily fair. So I actually think the Colts are going to be worse this year with Matt Ryan than they were last year with Carson Wentz. Also, like you said, I don't know how far Jonathan Taylor can take this team. Maybe he regresses a little bit from last year. Maybe that was kind of the Superman year from Jonathan Taylor. And, he is a guy who I hate to be saying this so early in his career. It's kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's only his 3rd year. He had a ton of carries at Wisconsin. Like, this is a guy who came into to the league ready to go because he had so much work. And so I'm just saying maybe this isn't a guy who has like a 5-year prime of like 500 or whatever you want to say. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if Jonathan Taylor can replicate that performance from last year with Matt Ryan as opposed to Carson Wentz. And I don't know if he can.
All right. Let's roll on to a team nobody's going to take to make the playoffs, and that is the Houston Texans.
I don't think we have much to talk about here.
Yeah, probably not. So they did add some good players in the draft. They got Derek Stingley Jr. They got offensive guard Kenyon Green, Jalen Petrie, who is one of my favorite safeties. They got John Mechie, who, did you see he's going to miss the season now? So terrible news for Mechie as he's battling, I think it was leukemia, and he's going to miss this whole season. So that's a big blow on a non-football level. That really stinks for John Mechie. So hopefully he's able to pull through that and get on the field in 2023. They signed cornerback Steven Nelson, guard A.J. Cann, defensive end Mario Addison, and linebacker Camus Grugier-Hill, another Eagles throwback. They lost Deshaun Watson, sort of, except you could argue they lost him a year before, but they got 3 first-round picks and then basically 3 third- or fourth-round picks. Danny Amendola retired. Justin Reed left for the Chiefs. They lost Jake Martin, and they lost quarterback Tyrod Taylor. On top of just being a bad football team, they have the number 28 strength of schedule. So they've got a very difficult schedule. Their over-under is at 4.5. It is -125 to take the over, -105 to take the under. Mark, can Davis Mills get this team over 4.5 wins?
The shame of it is, we talked about it all year last year. I was so impressed with Davis Mills at times. I mean, he had 2,664 yards, 16 touchdowns, 10 picks. They were 28th in passing, which they should have been 32nd with pretty much anybody else back there. I do think he earned his chance to kind of play as the quarterback this year on a dreadful team. But man, this roster is brutal. Like the John Mechie thing, it's horrible, and prayers to him and for getting through that. They did say it's like they caught it really early, and he'll be ready to go next year. But he was going to be their receiver, like wide receiver 2, I think. Like it's Nico Collins. It's I don't even know who their wide receiver 3 is, to be quite honest. It might be Philip Dorsett, maybe Chris Conley. That's pretty brutal stuff. Their offensive line is not great. I don't know if there's anyone besides Tunsil that's better than a 75 on Madden, to be quite honest. Like I don't know if there's anyone in the front 7 to be excited about. Literally, I don't know if there's a single person in their front 7 who I'm excited about whatsoever. So, and I know Lovie Smith's like a defensive guy and a front 7 guy and all that stuff. This is not only like the weird thing about the Texans is that they're very old. Like I think I heard the stat that they're like the 4th oldest team in the NFL, which is bizarre. Like, how is that possible that the Texans are the 4th oldest team in the NFL? Like, why go out and sign Steven Nelson? Why go out and sign Christian Kirksey? Like, some of those moves are just, you kind of like shrug your shoulders at them, I guess. But I guess you have to get to the cap for. It's a weird team. One of the weirdest teams I've ever seen, just in terms of like looking through the roster and looking at the names, and you're like, oh yeah, Marlon Mack. You remember him? Like he could be good. Like, it's a weird roster. Like, they're gonna win 2 to 3 games. So give me the under.
Yeah, it's going to be a brutal year for the Texans. The worst thing they could do, honestly, is win like 5 games. They they need to be really bad so they can go get their pick of quarterback, or they need Davis Mills to be the guy, and maybe he is. But the worst thing you could have is him be mediocre and play them out of that top 3 or 4 or 5 pick range. But this is going to be a rough season for the Texans, and everybody knew that. Just like last year was a rough season. So Davis Mills is going to get his tryout, and then they'll decide if they're going to move on or not next season.
Shout out David Culley, my man. They hired him to fire him last year. It's still a shame.
Yeah, that was a sham. So, okay, let's move on to the Jacksonville Jaguars, my hot take team to make the playoffs. Now, let me start here by saying I hate almost everything the Jaguars did this offseason. With the exception of signing Doug Peterson, almost every move they made this offseason was just awful. Drafting Travon Walker number 1 overall was a terrible decision that's going to haunt this organization. Mm-hmm. Devin Lloyd was a fine pick, I guess, and then they turn around and draft another linebacker, and their draft did not make sense. They could have done so much more with that capital. The Christian Kirk deal was just absurd. They did go get Brandon Scherf, which will help the offensive line. They got Darius Williams, cornerback. They signed wide receiver Zay Jones. But, I mean, Scherf, as good a player as he is, he's plugging a hole that was created by Brandon Linder retiring. So it's not like they added some stud. They're also replacing a very good offensive lineman. They released Miles Jack and Carlos Hyde. They lost Andrew Norwell, another offensive lineman. They lost DJ Shark, offensive guard AJ Cann, and defensive lineman Taven Bryan. So really what this comes down to is their schedule, which is fair. It's not awful. It's the 12th ranked strength of schedule. And it comes down to the head coach. No rookie quarterback in the history of the NFL has been saddled with as bad of a situation as Trevor Lawrence had last year. You can say like David Carr with the inaugural season of the Texans getting sacked like 70 times or whatever it was, and that was bad. But Trevor Lawrence was put in a position with a head coach who was actively trying to get fired in week 3. Like, it's ridiculous how much in shambles this organization was. And so I love the Doug Peterson hire, and it's not just homering for Doug Peterson, but if you want a guy that can come in and create a culture and be a player's coach, that's Doug Peterson. If you want a guy that can come in and work with a young quarterback, that's Doug Peterson. And so I just think it's a perfect fit there. I think Trevor Lawrence played a lot better than he gets credit for last year. Yeah, his numbers, his stats don't look great, but you put on the film, you have to realize how great he had to play to overcome some of the stuff that was in his face all season. And so I think Doug and Trevor Lawrence have a chance to do some really good things. Christian Kirk, as ridiculous as a signing as that was, he's a fine receiver. He's ridiculously overpaid, but it does at least give a receiving option there. They should get Travis Etienne back, which can be a weapon for that offense. So I don't like how they use their draft capital in the offseason. I don't like how they use their cap resources, but I do like what they did at the head coach, and I think that's going to trickle down to quarterback, and I think we're going to see a big year from Trevor Lawrence. So I think it's enough to win this division. The over-under is at 6 wins. I'm obviously taking the over if I'm picking them to win the division. The over is at -140. The under is at +110. So what are your thoughts on this team, Mark?
I have them winning 8 games, so I am on the over. I'm a little, hesitant to go any farther than that because there are so many concerns on the offensive line. I almost would have just preferred them to go draft Evan Neal, and then you at least have a guy long-term to protect Trevor Lawrence. It cannot be emphasized how much I agree with you on their offseason. I hate every single move they made outside of hiring Doug Peterson. The Christian Kirk signing is legitimately the most insane overpay I've seen in my lifetime watching the NFL. He got 4 years, $72 million. The Eagles were apparently the next highest bidder, offering $13 million per year. So it was 4 years for, I believe, 4 years for $52 million was what the Eagles offered, and it was way less guaranteed percentage-wise, apparently. I just want to thank the Jacksonville Jaguars publicly for signing that deal and making sure that the Eagles had to go trade for A.J. Brown instead of signing Christian Kirk. because I think the gap between A.J. Brown and Christian Kirk is immeasurable. That was just a funny little tidbit I wanted to throw in there because I heard the other day that the Eagles were in hard on Christian Kirk, and I don't remember hearing that at the time. So I thought that was a pretty funny tidbit there. But there's a lot to be excited about in the back seven of the Jags. The secondary, I don't think the secondary is as bad as people think that it is. And then you have my guy, Josh Allen, who Josh Allen's one of the more underrated players in the NFL, just like Yannick Ngakoue, in my opinion. Devin Lloyd, a guy who I think I was even higher on than you this year. I think he's a guy who's going to step in right away and be productive. And then Travon Walker, I don't think Travon Walker is going to be productive. I don't think he's going to be very good long-term or short-term. I don't see the way that he's going to transition to the NFL right away outside of just pure athleticism. But, hey, they picked him first overall, and they're listing him as a starter, and he's working out with the ones. So I guess they expect him to have an impact. So it'll be interesting to watch the defense more than the offense. I think the offense will be good. I think the offense, Trevor Lawrence is going to take a step. You have Travis Etienne, who not only is going to be a big piece as a running back, but is going to be a huge pass catcher for Trevor Lawrence and a huge third down option, just like he was at Clemson. James Robinson has been a really, really productive running back just in terms of running the ball over the last couple of years. And I think he's way ahead of schedule. He's off the pup. He's working out. It seems like he's going to be ready for week one coming off an ACL last year. So there's a lot to be excited about with both of those guys coming back from injury. They signed, and like you said, they signed way too much or they spent way too much money. They go out and they overpay for Christian Kirk. They go out and they overpay for Zay Jones, another guy who I don't think is very good. He had 49 catches for the Raiders last year, but they go out and give him guaranteed money. They go out and pay Evan Ingram, who had a ton of drops, but had some potential and some athleticism. So weird moves, but at least you have a lot of options now. At least they can kind of figure out which receivers work out of Kirk and Jones and Marvin Jones and Laviska Shenault and who they want to use out there. It's a weird roster, kind of. I don't know what to think of Jacksonville. I think just like the Raiders, they have one of the widest ranges of outcomes in the entire NFL.
I would have much rather seen them take Evan Neal with the first pick, and take George Karlaftis at the end of the first round, where they took, you could have still got an edge rusher out of it if you just absolutely needed an edge rusher. But to me, they needed to address wide receiver and offensive line early in this draft. And they really failed to do either one. And so I just didn't really like what they did in the draft. But we'll see how it plays out. I do have a lot of faith in Trevor Lawrence and in Doug to get the best out of this.
Yeah, I'm shocked to see that they have 19 of their 22 starters returning from last year. With so much turnover, it doesn't seem like that's the case. But I guess they added more than they lost. So not that means anything. They were a terrible team last year. But it'll be – they're one of the more interesting teams to follow going into this year, in my opinion. John Jansen, a guy who I do a lot of content with over at The Gambler, and he has his weekly or his daily show that he does every weekday called The Line Change. He is obsessed with the Jacksonville over in terms of the win total, obsessed with the prices on them going to the playoffs, winning the division. I'll have to connect you two to talk some Jags together because you two are both all in on some playoff Jags football this year. I'm not quite there, but I'm not mocking you whatsoever. I definitely see the vision.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is going to about wrap up our AFC West and South preview. We'll be back next week to do the AFC North and the AFC East, which will round out our preview shows. But Mark, before we get out of here, do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, nothing. Nothing that comes to my brain. Actually, you know what? I'll do a final thought. It's a quick one. It's a fantasy football thought. Tight end position this year. If you're not going to get a guy at the top of the draft, if you're not willing to go and get a Travis Kelce, if you're not willing to go and get a Mark Andrews in the first 2 or 3 rounds, the guy you want to draft is Dalton Schultz in round 5, 6, or 7. He is stepping into a role where the Cowboys just lost Amari Cooper. CeeDee Lamb will obviously pick up some of the slack there, but they didn't just lose Amari Cooper. They lost Cedric Wilson as well. And Dalton Schultz was already a top 5 tight end last year in fantasy. He's a guy who I'm drafting on pretty much every fantasy team that I do, every mock that I do. Dalton Schultz is one of my favorite fantasy values on this season. So it stinks that I used my final thought there on the Dallas Cowboy and praising him, but that's the first thing that came to my brain.
My final thought is going to be that it might be time to fire Omar Khan. I know the Steelers just hired him, but your favorite podcast, the Around the NFL podcast, reported that the Steelers offensive coordinator said Mason Rudolph has a great shot at winning the quarterback job. Now, if you pay Mitch Trubisky $14 million and then you go and draft a first-round quarterback, also you can start Mason Rudolph in 2022. I know you just got hired, but you should probably get fired. Like, that's just ridiculous. That's unacceptable. I know the Steelers have a great defense. I really don't get why you just wouldn't start Pickett. Like, in terms of pro readiness, he should be fine. But if it's not going to be Pickett, it has to be Trubisky. You can't go pay Trubisky $14 million to be your third-string quarterback. That's just ridiculous. So that's my final thought.
I totally agree. And I've heard Pickett looks terrible in training camp, and there's been a lot of negativity out there about Kenny Pickett. I have no doubts that if Kenny Pickett gets a chance on the Steelers roster with their defense and their weapons, he will succeed, and he will be, at the very least, kind of what Mac Jones was last year. So I totally agree with you. They should let Kenny Pickett get the chance no matter how he looks. But if it's not going to be Kenny Pickett, it should be Trubisky because he at least has the mobility to kind of deal with the Steelers' offensive line. So, the Mason Rudolph thing, it has to be fake news. Like, that has to be just something where, like, sometimes coaches just like hearing their own voice and just like talking about their own guys. Like that has to be what this is.
Yeah. I don't put a ton of stock into it, but it's fun to overreact to things during training camp anyways.
For sure.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for episode number 65 of Chalk Talk. Thank you for joining us here live. For those of you that were able to watch and drop comments, those of you that are listening or watching later, we appreciate you guys. If you enjoy what you heard on today's show, be sure you smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. Turn on notifications. Drop us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. That really helps us out as well. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at _. He is at Mark Henry Jr. I said that totally wrong. I am at _TPL. He is at Mark Henry Jr. _. It is late. I'm exhausted. The kids are driving me crazy this summer. I'm coasting in on fumes, but I've just got like 9 more days until they go back to school, and then I can start taking naps or something like that. I don't know what I'm going to do. But anyways, I'll be back. I'll be rested. I'll be ready for some real football to talk about, some real games to react to. But until then, from me, from Mark, from the Painted Lines, we will see you guys next time.